So we are in metaethics, and just to situate folks at one remove, metaethics is not trying to. It is a branch of moral philosophy, but it's not trying to answer questions about what actually is right or wrong or good or bad. Rather, it's trying to take a step back and ask about the nature of moral reality, if there is one, how we can know it, if we can, what the nature of moral judgments are. Are they more like straight up beliefs, or are they more desire like states? Questions like that. So within metaethics, there's a bunch of different ways of carving up the terrain, but here's one. And you might think there are three really big families of views. One's a view that we can call nihilism. Philosophers don't use that term that much, but it's designed to cover all the views that say there's no moral reality, really. Um, some versions of nihilism say, we most of us think there is, but we're just mistaken, in the
Hmm.
way that an atheist say will diagnose religious belief and religious discourse. Lots and lots of folks out there believe in it, but there's some fundamental presupposition that infects the whole picture, and really there's nothing to it. That's one view you might have about morality. Then another view is a view according to which there is a moral reality, but the reality is a constructed one. These folks are called constructivists, unsurprisingly. And the one analogy is between, say, morality and the law, or morality and etiquette, where you might say that really, if you drive 50 miles an hour in a 20-mile-an-hour zone, you'd say, yeah, that was illegal. And it's and if someone says that was illegal, you could say, yeah, what that person just said is true. And you can tell a story in epistemology about how you come to know that truth. And you might think, well, morality is more or less like the law, or like the etiquette, in that before human beings came on the scene, there wasn't any such thing. But for various reasons, and of course, different constructivists will tell different stories, it did come on the scene with us, and it's a social construction, basically.
Hmm.
It can be quite complex, but at bottom, if you ask, where does morality come from? The answer is it comes from the decisions or the attitudes of human beings,
Yeah.
either singly, that's a kind of subjectivism, or collectively, which typically yields a form of relativism. It doesn't have to, but it can. And then lastly, there's the family of views known as moral realism, which says there's a moral reality out there, hence moral realism, but the reality is not a constructed one. It's not one that's made up by human beings, either singly or collectively, either by reference to their actual judgments, or by reference to some cleaned up, hypothetical, idealized version of the judgments that we would have. Rather, morality, moral principles, say, moral standards, are quote unquote out there in a pretty robustly objective way. They await our discovery. We've invented the vocabulary to describe these things as good or bad, vicious or virtuous, things like that. But the truths that we are apprehending are not of our own making. So, and then within moral realism, because we're doing philosophy here, there are lots of other sub
There are
isms.
categories. Yeah.
Yeah, lots of different versions of moral realism, but that's basically the lay of the land.
And you're going to be in the more realism camp there, just so we
I'm going to be in the
giving
moral
away the.
realism camp, and within the moral realism camp, I'm going to be in what's called the non-naturalist camp. So, within realism itself, there are a bunch of different divisions, but the main division, at least within the last, say, 120 years, has been between those who think of themselves as naturalists and those who don't. A naturalist is someone who thinks of morality as on a par with other naturalistic disciplines, in particular the natural sciences. It may not be as advanced in its findings as the natural sciences, but the basic methodologies of discovering what's right and wrong, mirror the basic methodologies of the natural sciences.
Hmm.
The reality that awaits our discovery is continuous with the reality. It's a kind of natural scientific reality. And then there's on the other side the so-called non-naturalists. Not a very catchy term, but it's that and that's where I place myself. It's folks who think that moral realism is true. There's a robustly objective moral reality, but morality is relevant is not really like the sciences. No matter how much scientific investigation we do, we're not going to be. We can be certainly aided in discovering what's right and wrong by reference to that, but the truths aren't scientific ones. The methodology is not. We don't go to a lab. We don't need to go to a lab. We don't need to run actual controlled experiments on actual populations to make a determination about, say, the immorality of genocide. So, folks on in my little niche of the metaethical world are usually the ones who are subject to the most either ridicule, depending on your attitude at the time, or the most criticism among the realist camp, because you could see the attraction of being in nat if there are issues to do with realism, about realism, of course, in the first place, that turn a lot of people off. But if you're tempted to the realist view, a lot of folks go naturalistic because they think it's metaphysically respectable.
Right.
If you think of morality as just another kind of natural phenomenon, then you don't have to introduce these non-scientific features, properties in the world. And that leads to a more economical, metaphysically economical picture that's quite attractive to a lot of people.
I definitely want to, excuse me, dig into the non-naturalism aspect of things in some detail here. But first, I'm sure that some of the people in the audience have mostly confronted or experienced the idea of non-naturalism as theism, right? As that's you contrast naturalism with theism, but you're doing something different here.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and you're certainly right about the presuppositions. Um, in in the canonical text called Principia Ethica by a British philosopher, G.E. Moore, that came out in 1903, he was the one who coined the term non-naturalism,
Hmm.
and he distinguished naturalism from non-naturalism, but also from supernaturalism.
Hmm.
And that distinction has been, within philosophy at least, pretty honored over the last roughly 120 years. There's a very common thought among non-philosophers that if you're going to take up with a view like mine, you've got to ground morality in some kind of divine command or some kind of divine agency. But I think that's just a mistake. I think, and even for those who believe that it's the best version of realism is going to be one that is founded in some reference to God. They recognize at least the coherence and the intelligibility of a view of the sort that I hold, which is not a theistic one.
Yeah, okay, good. I mean, maybe before actually explicating what that view is, you can give us a hint just so I think that this is let me back up a little bit. I know for a fact that when you talk about things like morality, one of the issues that the discourse runs into is that people have pre-existing ideas, right? So it's not like talking about the Higgs boson where I can just explain things and people go, oh, yes, but everyone has their own little idea. So why don't you just give us a preview about why you believe this particular view called moral realism from the non-naturalist perspective?
Sure. Well, I'll take it in two steps. One is, why do I believe moral realism? And then why do I favor the non-naturalism? Is that
Yeah,
okay? Do it
perfect.
like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So here's why moral realism. Well, if you think back to the taxonomy I gave earlier, one way to see the attractions of moral realism is by seeing what's problematic with the opponents. It's
Hmm.
not this is not necessarily just an it's not necessarily an argument from elimination, but it helps to put the attractions of realism into sharp focus, I think. So if you've got a nihilist version, I myself think that's a version of last resort. I would think that, of course, but I invite those who aren't antecedently inclined the way I am to just think about the implications of a view according to which uh, we can take a big example, one I used earlier, according to which there really is nothing immoral about perpetrating genocide, or to take a smaller example, but one that hopefully is just as clear. Uh, a nihilist is committed to saying there's nothing wrong with deliberately accosting a vulnerable little kid and then smacking the kid as hard as you can and laughing at the kid
Right.
as he falls down the puddle of tears. To me, I think that when doing philosophy, there's no there's no alternative but to rely at various junctures on our intuitions. We can talk about that because
Hmm.
that itself is a philosophically controversial claim, but that's my view at least. And I think that some of our moral intuitions about cases of this, like the two I've just described, are as clear and as probative, actually, as any kind of evidence we can have in philosophy. So if you take a nihilistic kind of view, you've got to give up on that source of knowledge. And my thought is that if you have to give it up when it comes to morality, you're going to need to give it up all over the place in philosophy, and that's going to lead to an insuperable difficulty about gaining philosophical knowledge, insight, wisdom, and understanding.
So just to
So
summarize, your main objection to nihilism is just that it is in conflict with our intuitions.
that's right,
Okay.
and the substance of our intuitions. So
Right.
I, just invite someone to say, with a straight face, there's nothing wrong at all about perpetrating the sorts of acts I've just described. And I know a number of smart people who are also really nice people, by the way, uh, who can say that with a
Yeah.
straight face. I know most of those in the philosophical community who can do that, but I think that it comes at very high cost.
Well, I'm not. I guess I'm not a nihilist myself. I'm more of a constructivist. But just to do a little bit of standing up for them. I mean, couldn't it isn't? Can I restate your argument or try to put it in slightly different terms by saying it's not that the fact that we seem to have intuitions that overrides them, such as that they still are acting as if there is morality. Like you said, there are nice people, people who behave well, and therefore there must be some internal incoherence or inconsistency in a nice nihilism. Like Alex Rosenberg, who was a previous guest on the podcast, he proudly proclaims himself to be a nice nihilist.
Yeah, I myself actually don't think there's any inconsistency in being a nice nihilist. That's a charge I hear sometimes from my students when I introduce them to this idea. But in fact, I think you can be a perfectly coherent, nice nihilist.
Okay.
And also you can be perfectly coherent nihilist and say, look, I think it's a really terrible idea to perpetrate genocide or to smack kids just because just when you're angry, and that's also coherent.
Right.
All they're forbidden from saying, so to speak, so as to maintain consistency, is to say that their preferences register some kind of genuine immorality
Got it.
or
Okay.
morality. So you can say, look, it would be a better thing for everybody, not morally better, but people would be happier or less unhappy if we acted this way. And that's a perfectly consistent thing for nihilists to say.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's move on to knocking down constructivism then.
Well, there are lots of forms of constructivism, but here's my big beef with constructivism, and that is that I don't think that I have, I don't think that my say so makes it so when it comes to morality.
Hmm.
I don't have that kind of authority. I mean, I've been doing moral philosophy for 30 years. I'm not terrible at it. I'm not the best at it for sure. But but let's take the person who is, let's focus on people who are among the very best moral philosophers ever. It's still the case, I think, that their say so doesn't make it so. We are, each one of us, either individually or taken together, is fallible. in a whole range of ways. We're imperfect. We've got our biases. Sometimes they're known, sometimes they're unknown. We're in terms of processing information, we all are limited in various ways. We all have our tendentious prejudices, some of which we're unaware, others of which we're aware, but we can't fully correct for. All these things come into play in making moral judgments, and I don't see how it can be that any of us can have the requisite authority to be such that it's our attitudes or our agreements or our judgments that are the ultimate source of morality. I guess I just say one more thing to back that up. I'd extend this argument all the way to a critique of so-called divine command theory,
Hmm.
according to which you have God, who's perfect, all-knowing, at least, making the decisions about what's right and wrong. So the divine command theory says what's right is right if and only if and because God commands it, wrong if and only if and because God forbids it. I think even that kind of view is problematic. Even so, if even God, I mean, we can talk about reasons why if you want, but um, if even God's say so doesn't make it so, then surely we imperfect, puny little fallible human beings say so isn't going to make it so either.
Well, but as a constructivist, I don't want to spend too much time, like I said, sort of defending my own point of view here. But my immediate feeling about that would be that somehow it's begging the question that that kind of analysis seems to rely on the idea that there is an objectively true statement about what morality is, and then I would agree that we fallible human beings are not necessarily the right place to find that with perfect precision. But if you buy the analogy that morality is more like the laws of speeding or the rules of playing basketball that are constructed, then there's no such thing as the perfect rules for playing basketball, but there's nevertheless what we make up.
Great. That's you're absolutely right. And then just to take it to the next level of analysis, I just invite you to think about the implications of that kind of view. So I don't know what kind of constructivist you are, whether you think that moral principles, correct moral principles, are ultimately founded in each individual's attitudes, or whether it's a group effort. Do you want to do you want
I
to
think it's a
say anything
balance.
about that?
Yeah, and I mean, I very roughly think that there is a job for moral philosophy, namely to take the moral intuitions that individuals have and to listen to individuals talk to each other and try to rationally describe what their goals are, and from that to construct something that might not be objective and might not be settled and permanent, but is provisionally what we take to be good moral behavior.
Yeah. Okay, so on that kind of view, to me, the problem is that what has seemed to a bunch of folks to be cogent set of a cogent moral outlook after reflection strikes me as deeply problematic. And you might say, well, Russ, isn't that kind of arrogant? Why are you, Russ, the arbiter of what's right and wrong? And I want to claim my own fallibility here.
Sure.
But if you take a look at this kind of constructivist position, what it's going to do is it's going to say that in societies or among groups, when across societies, however you're imagining this to go, uh, if they were to make a determination after reflection that it's okay to make women second class citizens, it's okay to enslave a certain portion of the population, either because their skin color, because of their beliefs, or because their geographical, whatever it is, then constructivism says, morally speaking, that's right, and that's an implication that I find I just can't stomach.
Right. And I think that that's a
Yeah,
perfectly fair. I think that as a constructivist, you have to bite that bullet and you have to say, yes, like the process of constructing in different places and in different times might come up with things that I, Sean, who am also not the ultimate moral arbiter, think are horrible. And I would try to argue those people out of it based on whatever common moral intuitions we have. And I think that as a philosophical argument against constructivism, that argument really only works if, again, you kind of assume there is an objective, ultimate right and wrong, and then you're saying, but this method isn't getting it. But if I don't assume that there's an objective right and wrong, then this is the method that we have.
Yeah. Well, I agree that I agree actually that this is the method that we have, whether constructivism or realism is correct, where the method we have refers to how it is that we're going to engage in discussions with people who don't antecedently share our views.
Hmm.
The only way you can try to make progress there, I think, is to appeal to things that your discussion partner, some things that they're already going to be at least open to hearing and ideally will accept. If you can
Right.
find some shared bases from which to work, you're much likelier to get to consensus at the end. And that's true, like, whether constructivism is correct or whether realism is correct. But I also want to I also think that this scenario is plausible, namely that some people are mistaken and can't be shown the error of their ways. I think
Hmm.
that that's a general truth. Um, it's true about flat earthers, for instance, and
Don't need to
it's
tell me.
yeah, I'm sure I don't. But I also think that's the case in morality. I think that some people, we have examples in our public life right now. I'm not going to name names, but we've got examples of people who just won't see reality for what it is.
Right.
Let's forget about moral reality for right now. And there are a whole lot of explanations, plausible ones, for why that is. Self interest being among them, but not the only one, ideological indoctrination being another. And I think that these forces carry over into morality as well. It's possible for someone to just be blind to the moral equality of a woman or an African American. And there's nothing you can say. And furthermore, there might be no film they're willing to watch, or memoir or narrative they're willing to read. And even if they do read them, they may bring their blind, or what you'd say I'd be tendentiously calling their blinders, uh, to the reading or to the film watching, and they may be unconvinced in the end. Now, there are two diagnoses to make from that. One is a constructivist one, which says, if at the end of the conversation the person is not persuaded, then there's no moral reality that they're missing. My view is that they might well be missing something, and furthermore, this is the flip side of the point I've just been making. It's actually much harder on a constructivist view to maintain an attitude of fallibility than it is on the realist view. So it's harder to say what you did. I know I'm doing all the talking, so I
No, you're here to
apologize.
talk, please.
Yeah, it's harder to say what you said 3 or 4 minutes ago from a constructivist point of view than a realist point of view. And what I'm referring to is your profession, your admirable profession of fallibility and humility about things. If constructivism is true, then I'm not saying this is your view, but let's just take a
Hmm.
simple kind of relativist view about morality, according to which morality is grounded in some kind of social or cultural consensus.
Right.
Whatever follows from the deep mores of a culture or society is what's morally right. On that picture, here's what you need in order to know what's right and wrong. You need to know what your society stands for or what your culture stands for. And so long as you do, and you're not benighted about the relevant empirical facts on the ground, then you've got moral knowledge. If your culture is built on a rejection of the equality of women and men, if your culture is built on the view that women are there, have are here to serve men, that's one of the founding ideals of the culture. Then, so long as you know that and subscribe to it and can see how that plays out in the ordinary, say, domestic lives of women, and then it turns out you know a woman's place, morally speaking, you know a woman's place, and that is to serve her man or her men. I think that not only is the moral implication of that repugnant, but I think that it makes moral knowledge actually too easy to get. I think I know. I think if you were to say, well, Russ, that assumes that's tendentious, that assumes that there's an objective morality that these folks are straying from, and it assumes that there's an objective morality that might be more difficult to get than by means of the sort of sociological knowledge I've just described. That's the consistent thing to say. So I'm not going to say anything that's going to indict constructivists on on the grounds that they are necessarily have an inconsistent view. You can definitely coherently build up any number of constructivist views. I'm just pointing to implications that repugnant is a strong word, but with regard to that particular conclusion, it's one that I do find repugnant, and you know. I think there's no easy way out of that conclusion. Two conclusions, really. One is that when you think about the actual substantive moral implications of a view like that kind of relativism, I think they're very hard to stomach. And the second conclusion, which is the one I should have really been focusing on, is the point that if you're a constructivist, it makes, perhaps paradoxically, it makes moral knowledge too easy to get. Most people don't think that that could be a problem with a moral view, but I do think it's a problem with a moral view. I think that the the intellectual virtues of modesty and humility, the recognition of your own fallibility, sit best with a realist view. I mean,